Believe it or not, and I know most people do not, violence has been in decline for long stretches of time, and today we are probably living in the most peaceful era in our species' existence. The decline of violence has not been steady, it has not brought rates of violence down to zero, and it is not guaranteed to continue. But I hope to persuade you that it is a persistent historical development, visible on scales from millennia to years, from wars and genocides to the treatment of children and animals. I'm going to walk you through 6 major declines of violence. In each case, try to identify their immediate causes in terms of particular historical events of the era, and then tie them together in terms of their ultimate causes, namely general historical forces interacting with human nature. The first historical decline of violence I call the pacification process. Until 5,000 years ago, humans everywhere lived in anarchy without central government. What was life like in this state of nature? This is a topic that thinkers have speculated on for centuries. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes wrote that the life of man in a state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A century later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau countered that nothing can be more gentle than him in his primitive state. Now, in fact, these two men were talking through their hats. Neither of them had any idea what life was like in a state of nature. But today we can do better, because there are 2 sources of evidence about rates of violence in non-state societies. The first is forensic archaeology. You can think of this as CSI Paleolithic. Namely, what proportion of prehistoric skeletons have signs of violent trauma, such as bashed-in skulls, decapitations, arrowheads embedded in bones, or mummies found with ropes around their necks. I've assembled 20 estimates. They span quite a range, but they average out to 15%. That is, a resident of one of these societies had a 15% chance of meeting their end through violence. And let's compare that figure to those from some modern states. For example, the United States and Europe in the 20th century had a rate of death in war of about 2/3 of 1%. The entire world in the 20th century, including all of the world wars, genocides, and man-made famines, comes out to about 3%. And the world in the year 2005 has a bar that you can't see because it's less than a pixel, and its rate is about 3/100ths of 1%. The second source of evidence about rates of violence in non-state societies comes from ethnographic vital statistics. The spreading wave of farming and government that engulfed the world starting about 5,000 years ago left a few pockets of anarchy behind, namely the hunting and gathering and horticultural societies. And ethnographers who live with them for long periods of time can record the causes of death in those societies. Here I've plotted 27 of those estimates. Again, they span quite a range, but they average out to 524 war deaths per 100,000 people per year. That is, every year about 1/2 of 1% of the population is killed in war. Let's compare that figure to those from some modern states, and once again I'll stack the deck against modernity by picking some of the most violent countries in their most violent periods, such as Germany in the 20th century with 2 world wars, and it comes out at a rate of about 150. Russia in the 20th century, 2 world wars and a civil war at 140. Japan in the 20th century, a world war that ended in not 1 but 2 atomic strikes with about 40. The United States in the 20th century, 2 world wars and half a dozen other foreign wars, a rate less than 5. The world in the 20th century, again, throwing in all the deaths from genocides and man-made famines on top of the war deaths, comes out to about 60. The world in the year 2005, again, the bar is invisible. It's less than a pixel high at about 3/10 of a war death per 100,000 people per year. So not to put too fine a point on it, but when it came to life in a state of nature, Hobbes was right, Rousseau was wrong. The immediate cause was the rise and expansion of states themselves. leading to the various paxes that students of history read about, the Pax Romana, Pax Islamica, Pax Hispanica, and so on. When a king or emperor establishes control over a territory, they often try to stamp out tribal and raiding and feuding, not because they have a benevolent interest in the welfare of their citizens, but because raiding and feuding are a nuisance to the overlords, who would just as soon keep the people alive to supply them with taxes and soldiers and slaves. So just as a farmer has an incentive to prevent his livestock from killing each other, doesn't do him any good, so the early overlords had an incentive to get rid of tribal warfare that simply shuffled resources around or settled scores among the people at a dead loss to the overlords. The second historical transition can be illustrated by this woodcut showing a day in the life in the Middle Ages. And the process that brought this to an end is called the civilizing process, for reasons I'll soon explain. It turns out that homicide rates in Europe can be estimated for centuries because statistics in many towns and villages go back centuries. Historical criminologists have plotted them. I've replotted them here on a logarithmic scale, which runs from a tenth of a homicide per 100,000 per year to 1 to 10 to 100. And you can see that in every European country, there has been a massive decline from the year 1300 to the year 2000. A contemporary European has 1/30th the chance of being murdered as his medieval ancestors. Here I've shown the average of those 5 regions. For the sake of comparison, I've also plotted that 524 per 100,000 per year figure for the non-state societies. This gap is what I call the pacification process. This further decline is what I'm calling the civilizing process. The name comes from a classic book by Norbert Elias, in which he argued that during the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity, there was a consolidation of central states and kingdoms out of the patchwork of duchies and baronies and principalities that had covered the continent. With it, criminal justice was nationalized, and the constant warlord and feuding activity of the knights was replaced by the king's justice. Also during this time, there was a growing infrastructure of commerce, instruments of money and finance that were recognized within the boundaries of these newly consolidated states, and improvements in the technology of transportation and timekeeping that made trade easier and more efficient. As a result, zero-sum plunder gave way to positive-sum trade, a point that I'll return to. The third historical transition can be appreciated by considering some of the ways in which the early authorities kept law and order within their territories. Severe physical punishments such as breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, sawing in half, impalement, and clawing. But in a process that's been called the humanitarian revolution, these forms of barbaric torture execution were eliminated. This is a timeline showing that in the second half of the 18th century, particularly, there was a wave of abolitions of judicial torture, including the famous prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment in the Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Also abolished during this period was the profligate use of the death penalty for non-lethal crimes. In 18th century England, there were 222 capital offenses on the books, including poaching, counterfeiting, robbing a rabbit warren, being in the company of gypsies, and, quote, strong evidence of malice in a child 7 to 14 years of age. These were not just on the law books, but they were exuberantly applied. Samuel Johnson writes of a 7-year-old girl who was hanged for stealing a petticoat. By 1861, the number of capital crimes was down to 4. Likewise, in the United States, in the colonial period, in the 17th century, a majority of the executions were for crimes other than murder. Over the centuries, that declined so that nowadays the only crime other than murder that's punished by death is conspiracy to commit murder. The death penalty itself, of course, has been abolished in most of the Western world. Here's a timeline of countries that have abolished capital punishment. Most of the abolitions happened in the 20th century. But the blue timeline shows the number of European countries that actually carry out executions, showing that well before European countries struck capital punishment from the law books, they had lost their taste for applying it. America is, as I mentioned, a notorious exception to this trend, although even that is only true of 34 of the 50 states. And even in the states that carry out executions, the death penalty is a shadow of its former self. This graph from 1625 to 2000 shows the per capita rate of executions, which, as you can see, has plunged, so that the country now executes about 45 people a year in a country that has 17,000 homicides per year. Also abolished during the Humanitarian Revolution were witch hunts, religious persecution, dueling, blood sports, debtors' prisons, and perhaps most famously, slavery. Slavery used to be legal everywhere in the world. The Bible had no trouble with it. The so-called democracy of Athens was run by slaves. But in a process that began in the 18th century, slavery was abolished by an increasing number of countries, culminating in 1980 with the abolition of legal slavery in Mauritania, marking an era where, for the first time in human history, slavery is illegal everywhere on the planet. What were the immediate causes of the Humanitarian Revolution? My best guess was printing and literacy. This graph shows that prior to the 18th century, the economic efficiency of book production increased 25-fold. This technology was put into practice, and there was an exponentially increasing number of books published during the 18th century. And for the first time in history, a majority of Englishmen were capable of reading those books. Why should literacy matter? Well, one reason is summed up by the other name for this era, the Enlightenment, that a literate population is less likely to believe toxic notions and to have their superstition and ignorance replaced by knowledge. If you no longer believe that Jews poison wells, that heretics go to hell, that witches cause crop failures, that children are possessed by the devil, that Africans are brutish, that will undermine many rationales for institutionalized violence. As Voltaire said during this era, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Also, literacy is a technology of cosmopolitanism, of the mixing of people and ideas. And it's plausible that the reading of fiction and history and journalism, where you experience someone else's words in your own head, can get you into the habit of inhabiting other people's vantage points and therefore reduce cruelty and expand empathy, a point that I'll return to. The fourth transition has been called the long peace, and it speaks to the frequently heard assertion that the 20th century was the most violent in history. Now, it is certainly true that the Second World War was the deadliest event in human history in terms of the absolute number of people who lost their lives. But it's not so clear that it was the deadliest event in terms of the proportion of the world's population that became a victim of violence, because the world had an awful lot more people in the 20th century than in any preceding century. I'm going to show you the 100 worst things that people have ever done to each other that we know of, taken from a list by a man who calls himself an atrocitologist, Matthew White, in his great big book of horrible things. I've scaled them by the population of the world at the time and plotted them on logarithmic coordinates from 500 BC to 2000 CE. The graph shows that World War II only comes in at 9th place, scaled by the population of the world, and World War I doesn't even make the top 10. Moreover, history's worst atrocities are pretty evenly sprinkled over 2,500 years of human history. There is a funneling down of the data cloud as you get closer to the present. Presumably, this does not mean that in ancient times people only committed massive atrocities, and more recently we've also been committing medium-sized and small atrocities. but rather it's surely a reflection of the historical record, which becomes more complete and records more of these smaller events the closer you get to the present. Well, let's zoom in on those last 500 years where the historical record is clearer. And I'll show you trends in great power war. These are the wars between the 800-pound gorillas of the day, the countries that can project military force beyond their own boundaries, and which are responsible for a majority of the deaths from all wars combined. From 1500 to the year 2000, you see the first transition where this graph shows the percentage of years that the great powers fought each other. A few hundred years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war, almost 100% of the time. More recently, they've hardly ever been at war. Here we see a graph of the duration of wars involving a great power. Again, it shows a downward trend. History used to have things like the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, the 100 Years' War. The 20th century had the Six-Day War. Here we see the frequency of wars involving a great power. That is, how often would a new war start? And again, the trend is downward over the half millennium. But here's one trend that goes in the opposite direction. Even though countries were fighting fewer wars and shorter wars, the deadliness of the wars they fought, namely how many people were they able to kill per country per year, steadily increased up until 1950, where that curve did a U-turn. And so we're living in an era now, for the first time, when the frequency of wars is going down, the duration of wars is going down, and the damage done per time of wars is going down. If you combine all of these figures together and simply add up all the deaths, you get a zigzag curve, but one whose final point, corresponding to the end of the 20th century, is the lowest of the entire 500-year interval. We can now zoom in on the last 100 years and plot deaths from all wars of all sizes, and we see that although it's unmistakable that there were two bloodbaths in the 20th century corresponding to the two world wars, it did not represent a new normal or an escalating trend, but something closer to a last gasp. And for the last two-thirds of a century, the line pretty much hovers around the floor. This is the long peace, the fact that since 1946, there's been a historically unprecedented decline in interstate war. There were no wars between the two greatest powers of them all, the US and the Soviet Union, contrary to all expert predictions that a third world war was inevitable. No nuclear weapon has been used in war since Nagasaki, again, contradicting every expert prediction that World War III would be nuclear Armageddon. There have been no wars between great powers since the end of the Korean War in 1953. No wars between Western European countries, and people have to be reminded of what an extraordinary fact that is. Nowadays, you read about the current crisis in Europe, and the idea that, say, France and Germany would go to war would be absurd, ridiculous, unthinkable. But needless to say, this is a rather unusual state of affairs. Prior to 1945, Western European states started 2 new wars a year for 600 years. In 1945, that went down to 0. And there have been no wars between developed countries. The 44 countries with the highest GDP per capita have not waged war on each other. We take it for granted now that wars are things that happen in remote, poor, and backward parts of the world, but it wasn't always that way. It used to be the richest countries that were constantly at each other's throats, and rich countries with their big armies can do a lot of damage. Well, what about the rest of the world? Well, in a process called the New Peace, recently the long peace has been spreading to the world as a whole. Since 1946, as I've mentioned, there have been fewer interstate wars. There have, however, been more civil wars as newly independent states with inept governments defended themselves against insurgent movements, both sides armed, financed, and egged on by the Cold War superpowers. But since the end of the Cold War in 1991, even the number of civil wars have declined. And the crucial question now is which wars kill more people, the civil wars of recent decades or the interstate wars of the earlier decades? And this graph gives you the answer. Here we have, for each decade since the 1950s, the number of people killed per year of war in interstate wars, internationalized civil wars, and pure civil wars. And as you can see, the massive decline in deaths from interstate wars has not been compensated for by a corresponding increase in the number of deaths from civil wars. If you now add up all the deaths from all the kinds of war put together and subdivide it by the category of war, you get a stacked layer graph, one in which the thickness of each layer corresponds to the rate of death in war, that looks as follows. Here we have the colonial wars, when European empires tried to hang on to their colonies, a form of war whose death rate tapered off to zero and which no longer exists. Here you have the rate of death from interstate wars, that is a government on each side. It is a bumpy, spiky trajectory with peaks for the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Iran-Iraq War, but still the trend is unmistakably downward. And here we have the pure civil wars and the internationalized civil wars, that is the civil wars where some third party butts in on the side of the government. You add them all together, and once again there is a bumpy pattern, but superimposed on an overall unmistakable decline. And we see now for the first decade of the 20th century a thin laminate hugging the floor, showing a historically unprecedentedly low rate of death in warfare. So the dream of the 1960s folk singers is starting to come true. The world has almost put an end to war. What were the immediate causes of the long peace and the new peace? Well, three ideas were tossed out by Immanuel Kant in his 1795 essay, Perpetual Peace, which he argued that democracy, trade, and an international community all change the incentive structure to lure nations away from war. More recently, Bruce Russett and John O'Neill, two political scientists, have tested Kant's hypothesis in a large data set and have found that all three of these factors have increased over the course of the 20th century, and holding all else constant, all three of these factors are statistical predictors of peace. Here we have the fate of democracies and autocracies since World War II. Starting in the 1980s, the number of democracies has increased and has well overtaken the number of autocracies. This graph from the late 19th century to the present shows that after World War II, international trade skyrocketed. And this graph shows the number of memberships in intergovernmental organizations since the late 19th century, which has also been steadily increasing, representing the growth of an international community. The final historical decline of violence I call the rights revolutions. The targeting of violence on smaller scales directed against vulnerable sectors of the population, such as racial minorities, women, children, and even animals. The civil rights movement put an end to the practice of lynching. In the late 19th century, about 150 African Americans were lynched every year. By the 1950s, that had fallen to zero. Hate crime murders of blacks have been recorded by the FBI since the early 1990s. They were never very plentiful to begin with, about 5 a year. Even that has dwindled down to 1. And non-lethal hate crimes against blacks, such as intimidation and assault, have been in decline since they were first measured. The women's rights movement has seen an 80% decrease in the rate of rape from the time when it was first measured by the FBI, a two-thirds decline in domestic violence against women, and a decrease in the most extreme form of domestic violence, namely uxoricide, the murder of a wife or girlfriend, and mariticide, the murder of a husband or boyfriend. The graph shows that the decline has been even steeper for male victims than for female victims, showing that the women's movement has been very, very good for husbands. The children's rights movement has seen a steady decline in the number of American states with corporal punishment in schools, such as paddling and strapping. Every public opinion poll in the West has shown a decrease in the approval of the spanking of children and in the rate of spanking of children. Rates of child abuse have gone down, both physical and sexual abuse, since they were first measured in 1990. And children have been less likely to be the victim of violence from other children in the form of fights and non-fatal crimes at school. Finally, the animal rights movement has seen a decline in hunting, an increase in vegetarianism, both in the UK and the US, and a steep decline in the number of motion pictures in which animals were harmed. Well, this raises the question, why has violence declined on so many scales of time and magnitude? One possibility is that human nature itself has changed and that our taste for violence has literally been bred out of us. Well, I consider this unlikely for a number of reasons. One of them is that we continue to take enormous pleasure and fork over a considerable part of our disposable income to experience vicarious violence in things like murder mysteries, Greek tragedies, Shakespearean dramas, video games, hockey, and movies starring a certain ex-governor of California. And there are a number of studies trying to assess the prevalence of homicidal fantasies. And they ask people, have you ever fantasized about killing someone you don't like? Say someone who has humiliated you in public, or someone who has stolen your husband or wife or girlfriend or boyfriend. What comes out is that about 15% of women and about a third of men frequently fantasize about killing people they don't like. And more than 60% of women and 3/4 of men at least occasionally fantasize about killing people they don't like. And the rest of them are lying. A more likely possibility is that human nature is extraordinarily complex and has always embraced both inclinations toward violence and inclinations that counteract them, what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, and that historical circumstances have increasingly favored our more peaceable inclinations. What are the motives for violence in human nature? There's raw exploitation, the harming of a person that just happens to be an obstacle on the path to something that you want, resulting in rape, plunder, conquest, or the elimination of rivals. There's dominance, the urge among individuals to become alpha male, or the corresponding drive among groups for ethnic, racial, national, or religious supremacy. There's revenge and other forms of moralistic violence, where you feel entitled to harm someone in return for some sin or infraction, resulting in vendettas, rough justice, and cruel punishments. And then there's ideology, belief systems that proliferate through a society, such as those of militant religions, nationalism, fascism, Nazism, and communism, which can justify vast outlays of violence through a kind of utopian cost-benefit analysis. These ideologies envision a kingdom of perfect peace in the future, a world that will be infinitely good forever. Well, if the ends are infinitely good, then the means can be arbitrarily violent, and you're still ahead of the game. As the old saying went, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, ignoring the fact that people are not eggs. And imagine there are people who learn about your dreams of a perfect world, but nonetheless don't get with the program, might even oppose your plan for bringing heaven to earth. How they're the only thing standing in the way of a world that will be perfect forever. How evil are they? Well, you do the math. They are arbitrarily evil and deserving of arbitrarily severe punishment. Well, that seems pretty grim, but what does human nature have on the other side to counteract them? What are the better angels of our nature? There's self-control, the ability to anticipate the consequences of behavior and inhibit our violent impulses. There's empathy, the ability to feel others' pain. There's the moral sense, intuitions of tribalism, authority, purity, and fairness, some of which can actually increase rates of violence, but on some occasions they can decrease it. And then there's reason, the cognitive processes that allow us to engage in objective, detached analysis. The key question now is, which historical developments bring out our better angels and stay our hands before they can carry out acts of bloodshed? One possibility is that Hobbes got it right when he called for a Leviathan, a state and judicial system with a monopoly on violence, which can penalize acts of aggression and therefore cancel out the anticipated gain of aggressors. That can make everyone calm down, because not only does the Leviathan penalize you for committing aggression, but you know that it's penalizing your enemies, and so you no longer have to maintain a belligerent macho stance to deter them, nor do you have to have an implacable thirst for vengeance. That can reduce rates of violence because it circumvents the self-serving biases that social psychologists tell us that humans are prone to, where everyone always thinks that their enemies are perpetually treacherous and that their attacks are naked, senseless aggression, whereas they themselves are always innocent and the violence they commit is always justified retaliation. Well, when you have two sides both in the throes of these self-serving biases, you can get endless blood feuds and cycles of vendetta, which outsourcing your revenge to a disinterested third party, namely the government, can suppress. Some historical evidence comes from the pacifying and civilizing effects of states that I mentioned at the outset of the talk, and from the fact that you can watch this movie in reverse when the state retreats from territories, leaving behind zones of anarchy which are inevitably violent, such as the American Wild West, where the cliche of the cowboy movies was that the nearest sheriff is 90 miles away, so you have to defend yourself with your six-shooter, in failed states, in collapsed empires, and in mafias and street gangs that deal in illegal contraband and hence can't avail themselves of the dispute resolution apparatus of the state. If you're cheated in a drug deal, it's not as if you can file a lawsuit. Or if you're threatened by a rival drug lord, it's not as if you can call 911 because of the nature of the work that you're doing. And so mafias and drug lords and street gangs always carry out business with the necessary credible threat of violence. A second possibility is the theory of gentle commerce, according to which plunder is a zero-sum game. The victor's gain is the vanquished's loss. But trade is a positive-sum game, one in which everyone wins. And as improving technology allows the trade of goods and ideas over longer distances, among larger groups of people, and at lower cost, more and more of the rest of the world becomes more valuable alive than dead. To be concrete, much has been written about the rivalry of the United States and China, two countries that show very little affection toward one another. At the same time, it's rather unlikely that they will get involved in a war. For one thing, they make all our stuff. For another thing, we owe them too much money. Some historical evidence comes from statistical analyses of large data sets of countries showing that those with open economies and a greater reliance on international trade get embroiled in fewer wars, are riven by fewer civil wars, and host fewer genocides. Then there's the expanding circle, a theory advanced by the philosopher Peter Singer, though the idea goes back to Charles Darwin, in which evolution bequeathed us with a sense of empathy. But by default, we apply it only to a narrow circle of close friends and blood relations. However, over the course of history, one can see the circle of empathy expanding to embrace the village, the clan, the tribe, the nation, other races, both sexes, children, and perhaps eventually other species. Well, this just begs the question of what expanded the circle, and the technologies of cosmopolitanism that I mentioned earlier are a plausible explanation. Perhaps, namely the consumption of history, literature, media, and journalism, and opportunities for travel, which make it harder to demonize and dehumanize other groups if you rub shoulders with them and know what life is like from their point of view. And indeed, a number of laboratory studies have shown that if you get subjects in a lab to adopt the vantage point of another person by reading their words or listening to their voice, then they become more sympathetic not just to that individual, but to the category of people that that individual is thought to represent. Some historical evidence include the fact that the humanitarian revolution of the 18th century was preceded by the Republic of Letters, the dense interchange of information via print. The second half of the 20th century, with its with its long peace and rights revolutions, was preceded by the famous electronic global village, a term that was coined by a professor at this very university, Marshall McLuhan. In the 20th century, it's too early to know whether the color revolutions and Arab Spring will have a happy ending, but it's often been pointed out that these have been enabled by the rise of the internet and social media. Finally, there's the escalator of reason, the possibility that the centuries-long expansion of literacy, education, and public discourse have encouraged people to think more abstractly and more universally. This allows them to rise above their parochial vantage point and in turn makes it harder to privilege their own interests over others. It encourages people to replace a morality based on tribalism, authority, and Puritanism with a morality based on fairness and universal rules. It allows people to step back and recognize the futility of cycles of violence, and therefore to see violence as a problem to be solved rather than as a contest to be won. Some historical evidence includes the little-known fact that abstract reasoning abilities, as measured by IQ tests, increased over the course of the 20th century, the so-called Flynn effect, in which IQ scores increased by 3 IQ points a decade throughout the 20th century. Other studies have shown that individual people and entire societies with higher levels of education and measured intelligence, holding all else constant, commit fewer violent crimes, cooperate more in experimental games, have more classically liberal attitudes such as opposition to racism and xenophobia, and are more receptive to democracy. The final question that needs to be raised is why all of these forces seem to be pushing in the same direction. And my best guess is that violence is a social dilemma in the parlance of game theory. Namely, it's always tempting to an aggressor to exploit a victim, but it is even more ruinous to the victim. In the long run, since anyone can be either an aggressor or a victim, all parties would be better off if everyone agreed to avoid violence. The human dilemma is how to get the other guy to agree to refrain from violence at the same time as you do. Because if you are a unilateral, unconditional pacifist, the instant you lay down your arms, you will be a sitting duck for the other guy. So the question is, how do you get all sides to avoid violence simultaneously? And one can imagine that over the course of history, human experience and human ingenuity have gradually worked away at this problem in the same way that we've worked away at other scourges of nature, like pestilence and hunger. And indeed, all of the pacifying forces that I mentioned work to increase the material, emotional, or cognitive incentives of all parties to avoid violence simultaneously. Well, whatever the best explanation of the decline of violence turns out to be, I think its implications are profound. For one thing, it calls for a reorientation of our efforts towards violence reduction from a moralistic mindset to an empirical mindset. That is, instead of lamenting why is there war, perhaps we should try to pinpoint why is there peace. Not just what are we doing wrong, but what have we been doing right? Because we have been doing something right, and it sure would be good to find out what exactly it is. Also, I think the decline of violence calls for a reassessment of modernity, of the centuries-long move away from tribe, religion, and family, and toward reason, cosmopolitanism, universality, and science. Now, everyone agrees that modernity has brought us many gifts, longer lives, richer experiences, greater health, but there's always been a current of nostalgia and romanticism that questions the price. Is it worth it if we have to live with the shadow of nuclear war and terrorism and street violence. If, on the other hand, as I've tried to show, violence has gone down over history, not evenly, not to zero, but unmistakably downward, that, I believe, calls for a rehabilitation of the ideals of modernity and progress, and is a cause for gratitude for the institutions of civilization and enlightenment that have made it possible. Thank you very much.